Buddy, this is the fourth day in a row of Messari's Unqualified Opinions with me, Ryan Selkis at 2-Bit Idiot. It's been good to be back. Had a lot of good guests this week and excited to round it out with somebody who's part of the extended Messari family team, Band of Misfits. Nathaniel Wittemore, who in my opinion is one of the top curators in the industry, probably the top. I believe, are you still one of only 5 people that BitMEX's founder?
Yes,
actually,
Arthur
Hayes.
He's up to 8.
Arthur Hayes follows 8 people in the industry, and LW is one of them. Also has just an epically short Twitter handle, which we can get into. But you're a tough person to introduce because you do a lot. You are independent, but you're kind of your own independent brand. Marketing connoisseur, crafter of narratives, general. Likable person that somehow has managed to make a name on Twitter without just getting like pulled into the muck and having everybody pissed off at you all the time.
And that was weird.
So why don't we start just with kind of your backstory and make sure that this we're simultaneously retweeting. But let's talk a little bit about your backstory, how you got into the industry, what your background is that has allowed you to carve out this really interesting, powerful niche as kind of like a one-man brand, and then we can start diving into some of your areas of expertise and some of your kind of more macro level thoughts on the industry. But
sure.
First, who is the mystery man NLW behind the curtain?
The backstory. I mean, I have a weird backstory, which I think a lot of people in this industry do. The 2 parts that I think are most relevant or like obviously connected to crypto are one, on the surface, the most clearly connected is that I spent a decade in San Francisco, back and forth between VC roles, operator startup roles. I advised a company that went through Y Combinator, the same class as Coinbase, so that was the first. One of the first exposures that I had to Bitcoin, and so that part was kind of obvious, but it's actually interesting because when I was in San Francisco, especially like those early years when Coinbase was coming up, the narrative of Bitcoin was so focused on just another mobile payments thing, right? And there's a dozen different like mobile payments things that would help you buy coffee at your thing. It was unbelievably unfathomably boring from that perspective. We even at that company, so I advised that company when it was at that point, and then later I ended up working with them and helping them basically build out a platform to help corporations learn about new technology. And we were making videos for Coca-Cola about blockchain and Bitcoin as early as like early 2015. But it's still what people were interested in was like what the payments use case and this sort of thing. And I know for sure that there were other folks who were talking about it in different ways back then, but that was the dominant, you weren't going deep on it kind of Silicon Valley story. And it wasn't actually until I left Silicon Valley much later and moved away. I live in the Hudson Valley now. We moved back to be closer to family, and was kind of like revisiting all the things that had been like partially interesting, but I had ignored effectively because I was kind of myopically focused on my last startup. And interestingly, what captivated me about Bitcoin in particular and crypto more broadly at that time when I finally did deep back in, it connected actually to the earlier part of my career, which is before I was in San Francisco. I built effectively a program design center for students who want to change the world at my alma mater. So I went to Northwestern, and it's like the only hat that I have that I like. But I was there just after September 11th. And after September 11th, there was an incredible explosion of students who wanted to go abroad. And in particular, an explosion of students who wanted to go abroad to make a difference. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of them was that in the 90s, the story was that the world was fixed, like we had won the Cold War and everything was great. When in point of fact, the 90s was the deadliest decade since World War II by a large margin. And so as everyone got to college, I think, September.
How do you calculate that?
In terms of number of people who died in violent conflicts.
Where were the conflicts that
in the 90s?
I know there was, I'm not sure the exact dates, but there was,
Rwanda, Kosovo, and the Balkans.
There's Eastern Europe.
Yeah. So it was basically just the pains of the world resettling post the fall of the Soviet Union.
That's a fascinating stat. I never would have realized that.
Yeah, and so anyways, you have all these kids who are like, holy shit, this is actually quite different than what I had thought, you know. And February 1994 to me wasn't Rwanda. It was when Green Day's Dookie came out. And so anyways, there was this whole generation that was interested in going abroad, and in particular going abroad and making a difference. And counter to the popular narratives, they were going abroad to try to make a difference and finding that they were absolutely dog shit at it. There was no actual ability for them to do anything meaningful, that they were planted with these organizations, and it was just basically a waste of everyone's time. And this is full on through every type of company or every type of organization that they found. And the interesting thing is that the narrative is kind of the millennials as this like won a gold star, like won a trophy for participation. But the kids that I saw who were coming back, and we spent a lot of time, I sent kids actually one summer to like 40 different countries. Myself, it was 2005, I started in the Balkans, went to the Middle East, and ended in East Africa. And these kids knew that they were being useless, and they knew that they were part of a superstructure that was just trying to clean up the messes of someone else, and they wanted to figure out what they could do better about it. And when they got back to their colleges, to their universities, the answer was, well, go get a degree in development studies. And I had this very visceral reaction to the idea that you have a generation raising their hand saying they want to do something and being told to wait or go get another friggin' degree. So Northwestern was at that time
part of a very different superstructure.
Yeah, exactly. Like, let's throw one huge institutional apparatus at another and see if we can fix poverty.
Let's get you so loaded up with debt that you can't possibly imagine fixing some of the other structural problems.
Exactly. And so Northwestern it was a really lucky time that I was there. They had gone from kind of like this happens sometimes, but they had gone from like a great regional university to just a great university, and with it they had increased their endowment by a factor of like 4x from 2 billion to 8 billion, and so they were flush with cash, and they had already said that global engagement, whatever the hell that meant, was one of their like 4 or 5 operating prerogatives. So I was like, look, I have a way to spend some of that money, and ended up I started a conference first while I was still a student. And then I got a grant to start a program design center that was actually sending kids out. That's now gone on. It got endowed for $100 million by Bernie Buffett, who's Warren Buffett's sister, long after I left, because I was good about founder syndrome. But anyways, that whole experience, I knew that I wasn't going to stay there. And the reason that I wasn't going to stay involved in that industry is that I've always, I am so glad that there are people who will dedicate their lives to fixing the problems of the structures we have and cleaning up. I want to be a person who impacts the structure so they don't make the problems in the first place. And so I ended up connecting during that time with, it wasn't even a company yet, but a guy named Ben who was running a thing called change.org that had just launched with like a URL and one coder basically. And that's what pulled me out to San Francisco. And so somehow through the funnel of all my time in San Francisco, I had like left that behind a little bit. But when I broke out again, and when I started to sit back, and when I revisited Bitcoin, I realized that actually the part of it that was so interesting to me was not the connection to tech and buying coffee for your investor in a cool way at a Coupa Cafe meeting. It was the change.org side of me. It was the go out and see what the superstructure of the world is and how you fix that power. So that's the very long-winded way of how I ended up actually figuring out that it was not a technology movement that captivated me. It was something much different.
It was probably a currency.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm curious how you deconstruct the crypto world, because I'm firmly of the opinion at this point that we're actually talking about 2 totally different ecosystems right now. There is Bitcoin, which is kind of asset-centric, to your point, right? It's not just about the cool payment rails applications. This has now developed enough of a mysticism and a groundswell of near religious belief in its value, that it truly is asset first, and the underlying technology is just how you move that value around. Everything else in crypto seems like it's a totally different movement, right? Whether you're talking about decentralized applications or decentralized resource sharing, or how do you take control of your data, everything else that's being built, hasn't really seemed to have found product market fit yet, maybe close with some of them. But B, it's just very tech-centric, right? So all the enthusiasm, the activity is around the developers that are actually building these applications and building the infrastructure to support potentially future applications. Is that right? How do you, what's your mental model for the crypto world? And I ask that because you'll get 10 different answers from 10 different people, but I think you have a unique way of synthesizing information and helping people kind of filter through everything and categorize or subcategorize. So what's your take? Do you think about it entirely differently? Am I right, or do you agree, or
No,
how do you help people navigate this when you're pulling them in for the first time?
I absolutely agree, and in fact, I think that it's at least two different worlds of Bitcoin and everything else. I think that there's probably a lot of gradations even within everything else, and I don't mean that in a sarcastic or dismissive way, right? Like, to me, so it was really interesting as I watched kind of over the course of the last, call it 18, 24 months, right? Since the ICO boom really faded. And the ICO boom was weird because it was so clearly dead for like 6 months before it actually died. Like, I mean, I remember even being at Consensus 2018 and it was dead. Like, that shit was, everyone knew that it was dead, but it didn't matter because it probably had 3 or 4 more months of cashing in on it in some pockets, and that's why it felt so weird and frenetic at that event. That's the one.
And just dirty.
Yeah, it was weird. It was so weird because it's like, this is dead, but at the same time, like, there was, it really wasn't until like August of 2018 that I think ICOs there was no more, right? And that, I think, so anyways, but the point is that, like, since that time, since it started dying, obviously the Bitcoin narrative has been resurgent, and obviously the maximalist took that term, and that was once kind of levied against them, and used it as a badge of honor, and have recreated kind of their own identity narrative around that. And I think the interesting thing is that as I was trying to first understand kind of that perspective and where people were coming from, like, part of what it was, to me, I think that what I saw a lot, and I don't want to be put words in people's mouths, because this is an industry where people are very comfortable articulating exactly what they mean without you having to interpret it for them. But I often felt that when people were really passionate about, in particular, the monetary implications of Bitcoin and what it meant as a non-sovereign store of value, as a non-sovereign money, as an uncensorable, unconfiscatable money, it wasn't so much that Ethereum and the Ethereum ecosystem of projects and dApps were like useless or scams, although for some that they were. That's obviously a point of view. But that was the things that they were trying to solve were so small in comparison to that bigger game of disrupting an entire kind of modern, since the beginning of nation state system of sovereign money being the paradigm, that how the hell could you spend time on anything else? And on top of that, I think that Bitcoiners tend to have a really strong sense of resource competition, let's call it, right? So to the extent that perspective gets vigorous, let's say, it's that they have a sense that they're competing for limited time, attention, capital, and so that's why it's the focus on Bitcoin is so aggressive. So I think that that's kind of there is this Bitcoin side that is really playing this very fundamental, not just technology, not just economic, but I even think political game. Even though I've been talking about this a lot on the 3 at 3, the daily podcast and video that I do. I think this is, like, we're finally recognizing that this is a political force, an inherently political force, and that the asset itself may be apolitical, and that is actually in part of what makes it so powerful and so kind of exciting to people, but that it as a force in the world is an inherently political force. So you have all of that over here, and then you have this whole other set of things, which are there's tons that's really interesting there, right? Like, I remember if you look at, I think probably the most liked or clapped or whatever Medium piece on this industry ever comes from Chris Dixon. It was Why Decentralization Matters, which I think was in like February of 2018. And that was really laying out the Silicon Valley take on how big platforms, the big Web 2.0 platforms, which were supposed to be the greatest liberators of individual user contributions ever, right? Like, the shift from Web 1 to Web 2 was about from consuming to creating. And so all these platforms were about to be that. It was all user-generated content, and you create things, and you're empowered, and gave rise to the influencers and all these sort of things. And on the one hand, we did get that, but we also got the most powerful monopolies in some ways that have ever existed. And we have no idea how to deal with them. And Chris Dixon's post effectively articulated that these companies like Amazon, had hit a point where they were no longer able to grow horizontally, so they had to grow deeper vertically in each and every user, which meant an inherent shift to extraction and to a focus on extracting as much as you can from each individual user, and that creates the opportunity and the demand for a new development paradigm, which is obviously all the Web3 stuff. So you have that whole strand of things over here. Then you have all of the kind of DAO stuff, which is about human organization. That's, like somewhere between a Facebook group over here and a full nonprofit over here. And what does that mean? And so you have all of these interesting things that are happening that are, I believe that you can, it's not mutually exclusive to think that there's lots that are interesting about them, while also one being much more interested in one or another, just based on your kind of personal disposition, what problems you think are worse in the world, how you see the world. But two, also recognize that they are at fundamentally different cycles of product market fit, to use an overused term, or just kind of like market acceptance. So I think there's at least two worlds, and it's the more that we can be precise about those terms and help people figure out where they're supposed to be swimming, I think the better.
How do you think about kind of crafting narratives for the various projects, right? It almost seems, whether it was kind of organic, that some of these quick one-liners developed, or whether it was intentional, it does seem like the top market capitalization projects have very easy one-liners to remember, whether they're warranted or not. Mm-hmm. How much value is there in a sentiment-driven market and having a cohesive, very simple narrative around your project, your company, and how is that gameable, right? Or like, how easy is it to kind of parse through if someone has a narrative that sticks, whether it's just bullshit or an actual marketing fluff, or if it's like the good form of marketing, which is, no, this is authentic, but it's also like it sticks because it's very easy to remember and it's kind of consistent with everything we know about this person, projects, company, etc.
I think that there's a couple things. Like, narratives are about resonance in some way. They're about distilling what a project, what a movement, is about in a way that resonates deeply and quickly with people. The shortest version of narratives, and in some ways, because of that, the most powerful version of narratives are memes, because they destroy nuance in favor of something that actually distills and captures that essence, but in a really, really fast way. That's why memes can be so viral, they can be so powerful. Now, the flip side is, the problem with memes is that they destroy nuance, right? And so it's tough, but I think that you have, from companies in this standpoint, there's again, let's almost break things into two parts. There's the underlying kind of protocols, right? So if we go back to what we were just talking about, we're not just talking about segments of an industry, we're talking about different goals competing for the attention of the people who are interested in that industry, right? Are you going to spend the X amount of hours you have on DAOs and new ways to organize humans, or are you going to spend the X amount of hours that you have on decentralized finance? Or are you going to spend it on just Bitcoin, the idea of a new non-sovereign money system? Or are you going to spend it on something else that I haven't even mentioned, right? Mm-hmm. Like rights tracking for music or whatever it is. And so in some ways, there's narrative competition around just what's worthy of people's time. And that actually operates above and beyond and kind of outside of company narratives. I think where company narratives come in is understanding what your stake in whichever space you're trying to play in is. What are you trying to offer that space? And I think that, when I work with companies, it's really about the combination of two things. On the one hand, I'm trying to help them figure out, like, what is actually driving that? Like, what is the process of figuring out the narrative of a project isn't really it's not exactly a marketing exercise in the traditional sense of trying to figure out the catchiest one-liner. It's more like, why are you guys doing this? How do we distill that down? What's the point, And so in some ways, it's almost like the development of kind of like clarity around mission and vision. And as you might expect, some companies just have that, they know it, right? It's super clear and apparent to them. But then you have to blend that with, what is the narrative space based on those larger market conversations, right? And that's the thing I think the companies don't do. They often will take the time to figure out what they're about, but what they don't understand is they're just messaging into a void or into a vacuum without understanding how those kind of competitions for just the larger why and what in the industry are happening. So I don't know. I think that your question to some extent was more about almost the kind of the meme fueled battles of like what to spend our time on. And I think it's interesting to.
But it's broad, right? There's different categories. So maybe we'll take it from like the meta and conceptual into the the tangible. So
Sure.
Let's talk about some of the different types of memes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So ones that stick, that are authentic, that are like the most salient way to explain a project or company. Ones that destroy nuance,
Mm-hmm.
right? And are catchy and powerful nonetheless, but still there's something lacking underneath
Mm-hmm.
it. And then maybe just talk about some of the outright silly ones, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or some of your favorite, because you study this closely. So we can go in whichever order you want, but let's talk about some examples of the
Sure.
three, or maybe there are more categories, but those are the three obvious ones that stand out, right? Authentic, really powerful, but ultimately vapid,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then the just horrible ones, just cover to cover.
Well, the interesting thing is that middle category.
Or is there such a thing as a bad meme, right? Because if it sticks, then it goes.
Well, that's actually what the interesting thing is. That middle category, stickiness is kind of the vector of successfulness rather than whether it's it's kind of the right meme will meme itself into existence, right? It becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. Like I often say that this is actually like a battle for competing self-fulfilling prophecies.
Yep.
But I think let's take actually that most like resonant, authentic level. I think again there's multiple battles going on at any given time, and kind of in the middle of it, and for those of us who are hanging out on crypto Twitter and Bitcoin Twitter all the time, there's this just constant shifting back and forth where we're talking at each other, and it's in some ways it's almost like we're competing to figure out what we level up to the larger scale.
Mm-hmm.
Now then there's like the larger kind of narrative question about what a thing is in the world. I would say that if you look at the last 6 months in particular, there has been a major shift. A massive shift, I believe, in how the macro markets or macro market participants, thinkers, etc., are looking at Bitcoin from how they did a year ago. And they have adopted this kind of generational hedge SOV type narrative, right? It's why you see Raul Paul on all these podcasts now. It's why you're seeing Dan Tapiero get into the space. All these guys who have been a step removed, or maybe they looked at it and they were interested and then they moved away and then they came back, which is kind of what Raul is. And what they're looking at is obviously the Fed starting to cut rates again. They're seeing money pumped into the economy. They're seeing the rise of MMT as an ideology. They're seeing stocks at the highest price they've ever been. They're seeing real estate at the highest price they've ever been. They're looking at what happens when boomers have to start selling those things because they can't keep getting a return, and whether millennials will buy it. Millennials are likely to be uninterested at those prices. And they're saying, shit, there's this whole other thing, which why not take the option on that, right? And so this is much less about the idea of whether Bitcoin is a safe haven asset in the short term. I think these things are getting a little conflated right now. Really, they're only getting conflated because like 3 weeks ago it performed really well on a day that Trump was angry at China and everything else performed badly, and it was on 6 different cable news stations about whether Bitcoin is a safe haven. That's almost distracting to the larger question, which is, does it act as a generational hedge? Is there a generational mega shift into being interested in something like this as opposed to the traditional places that they can park their money? And
so in this example though, what's the meme that people are rallying around? Is it safe haven? Is it?
It hasn't been defined exactly, but I think generational hedge that's the term that I keep coming back to. Mm-hmm. But it's this idea of an alternative SOV, a safe haven. It's not even safe haven because the baggage of safe haven is that it's caught up in the way that just markets function generally and like short kind of micro patterns, and I don't think that's the point. I think that the SOV is the same kind of thing. Like it's really like, again, digital gold is convenient for the sake of memeing, but it's bigger than that, right? In terms of how people are looking at it. They're saying, like, from a superstructure perspective, if you are talking about the mega trends that will define a generation, Bitcoin starts to look appealing. So I actually think in some ways this is an area where the narrative has raced a little bit ahead of the meme, and there isn't a quick and easy meme yet. The digital gold is shorthand, safe haven is a little bit of a shorthand, but each of those things is bringing with it the baggage of what those things used to mean in different contexts.
So that, I think, maybe a good example of an emerging battle over kind of what is the definition, what is the meme that sticks. What are some of the most powerful memes in the industry right now? We'll come back to whether, kind of which bucket they fit in, but just objectively, good, bad, positive, negative, company, protocol, like what have been the most effective, even if we hate them?
So I think that one thing that's interesting is that since Bitstein's speech down in Austin, which got everyone fired up and talking, and it was about memes. It was like a meme warfare blueprint, basically. The fascinating thing that happened. One is it did its damn job in the Bitcoin community, because you have seen so many Bitcoin fixes this, and all of the things that were like listed by him in that. Since then, I think in of that bucket, Bitcoin fixes this has been enormously effective, because it is for people who hate it. It's like
talk a little bit more about this presentation.
So Bitcoin fixes the presentation. So Michael Apitstein on Twitter went down to I can't remember what the name of the conference was. It was a Bitcoiner conference in Austin.
Michael
Texas.
Goldstein, who's one of the co-founders of Satoshi Institute, along with Pierre Rochard, someone else who's very outspoken as a quote-unquote maximalist.
Look at me referring to people by their handles, not their names.
Well, it's fair enough, because I knew Bitstein, but I was having trouble placing the name for a second, and then I finally got to it.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's talk about this presentation.
Well, yeah, so I mean, this presentation it basically was an argument for how you deal with people who are combative, like not interested in Bitcoin, other people in the industry, shitcoiners, all this sort of thing. And it was a couple things. One, I think it was a bit tongue-in-cheek, but also serious enough that people were going to take it seriously. Mm-hmm. The text of it was shared before the video was shared. There is plenty of outrage to go around and invites in this industry already. And so the fall, like basically the critique of it was that it is just another example of why this industry is so hostile to newcomers, because we're cannibalizing each other effectively.
And Goldstein's points were basically, here's how you should engage, and there's three different types of people. There's like Bitcoin believers, you're in the in group. There's kind of agnostic people that just don't know enough, or they haven't been educated, or pre-coiners, I think you call them, right? And here's what we should do to educate them, and you need kind of a consistent message, which anyone in marketing would tell you, right? And then there's the no-coiners, and I forget what the line was exactly, but it was like the no-coiners should be bullied,
that was the
relentlessly and repeatedly, and we should not let up until like basically they're dead. Right?
The word
and that was what sparked some of the
word that triggered people is bully. Mm-hmm. And I think I understand why. Like I'm sympathetic to that for sure. Just based on the word. I mean, fucking, I have a kid who's coming up. Like I think about like the normalization of bullying as a tactic, and that's really like what dragged the conversation to another direction. But without relitigating that whole fight, what's interesting is that effectively this was a presentation about memes and the power of memes and how Bitcoiners were better at memes, but here's how you level up your meme game.
Yep.
So let's talk about two things. One, let's talk about what has happened with Bitcoiners since that presentation from a mimetic standpoint, and let's talk about what's happened with everything else, because I think it's actually really fascinating. So one, there were a few specific memes that were pushed, and the one that I've noticed the most resonance with is Bitcoin fixes this. Mm-hmm. So the way that you use this is, someone tweets their disbelieving, eye-popping critique of some crazy thing that happened in the macro markets, or whatever it is, time preference things where people are short-termist instead of thinking long-term, and you tweet Bitcoin fixes this. I think that there's part of the power in this, and why it's been so resonant, is that like if you don't like Bitcoin, it's so annoying that you can't help engage. Like, it's so almost like cringy and ridiculous. You can take it to such a ridiculous extreme that people are like, they throw down their phones in anger and want to fight about it, which obviously is just more attention on the thing.
Yep.
The second thing is it effectively asks people who are kind of paying attention maybe halfway or passively, like, well, how can it fix this? Which is an invitation to dig in more. So I actually think in some ways, going back to this idea of this generational hedge, the Bitcoin fixes this meme, like nudges in that direction in a way that I think has been pretty powerful to see.
And what's interesting is I think not enough people appreciate this. This is certainly true, even for me back in 2013, when I was just on like the our Bitcoin forums. That's where my handle came from, right? I just created this throwaway account to engage people on Reddit, which was already a cesspool even back then, right?
This was before Alexis came back.
And one of the things that I found fascinating was you could learn a lot from the folks that were like regurgitating all this shit. And you wouldn't necessarily walk away if you had half a brain and say, oh, well, this tech isn't interesting because this person's argument is stupid, right? Like, the stupid argument in many cases, or like the shit post in many cases, did force you to engage. And if you're someone that might be attractive to bring into the community, as it were, you're kind of okay, even with idiots trolling them, because if they spend any time on it, then you can get them at least to the point of, well, actually, like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, but this, and this, I hadn't really thought about it until I like got into this debate, right? Like, actually, this could be interesting, and then maybe that idiot forces you to engage with someone that actually knows what they're talking about, and you at least kind of get people going down the rabbit hole. But I don't know of many people that got into the industry and their first impression was with like world-class thinker and explainer, right? Like, I don't know how many people got in from like sitting at the same table as Wences, Cesaros from Zoppo, or like Ology, right? Or like any of like the luminaries were like, well, obviously if this guy had me in a room for like an hour on the whiteboard, I'm gonna fucking buy whatever he's selling, right? But you can't grow a community like that. Like, you have to have like you have to have some real interesting people. We'll be politically correct, like at the periphery, and they're still, you could argue, serving the valuable function.
I mean, I think that there's also like a little bit of humility that we could use here, which is like, to the extent that we are worried that these sort of in-group arguments will turn people away. I mean, maybe. Like, certainly, like, if I could snap my fingers and have everyone just have, like, productive conversation all the time, I would, right? Like, if you look at my act of rebellion from, like, the infighting is that I just don't cover it with my media. You're never going to see an LRS thread with me highlighting, like, some stupid back and forth. Like, it's not valuable.
I disagree about the value of it, because I actually, if I could wave a magic wand, I would keep it as fucked up as it is right now. I would keep it. It's like the perfect level of like fucked up. Like the just total chaos. In the system is why the New York Agreement was not passed. And it was like, okay, we didn't come to the table and have like a productive dialogue, and then have all of the major miners and all the major funded investors and exchanges come together and say, you know what, this is the productive, smart thing to do. We're going to compromise on this. It was like Trump hats and like vicious online behavior that led to a resolution. Well, and you can argue whether that is structurally good for Bitcoin. Maybe we're going to find out in 5 years that was like the end before anybody knew it was the end, because now we can't scale, or now Bitcoin gets outflanked or whatever. But it certainly doesn't seem like that right now. It kind of seems like the chaos is what made the network more resilient.
That's a fair point, and maybe that's like more a better way to describe it is more like, I think that it's loud enough and I don't have to highlight that sort of thing. I wasn't doing LRS during UASF. I probably would have felt pretty different about it then. You know what I mean? So let's actually go back to this meme question though, because there's another impact. I actually like Bitcoin fixes this as a thing. I think it's fascinating, and I think it's interesting to watch. But the part of this whole thing was basically a critique that was like, other communities can't meme as well as we can, and damn if they didn't listen. Like, so I don't know if you've been watching, but I feel like over the last 2-3 weeks, like the Ethereum community has been like, fuck it. let's play the same game. Let's not write off the strategy because of where it came from. There have been more ETH is money posts over the last 2 weeks. Like, it is all over the place. Now you have podcasters who are being like, is ETH money? Newsletters being like, is ETH money? It's coming up on like bigger things, like, you know, and then all of a sudden, when news comes today or whatever, like yesterday, that BitPay is now letting Ethereum, merchants accept Ethereum, all the ETH is money people are like, we told you, see, ETH is money. And all of a sudden that news has context in a meme. Yep. Like, I'm totally holding aside any substantive arguments about this, but like they're memeing it, and at least from the standpoint of like forcing this conversation, it's forcing the conversation internally. Like, is ETH money? Like, that's the biggest thing that people have been talking about, Vitalik's presentation or his interview at Ethereum, right? It's like his response to that. So,
certainly in the last month, maybe this year, that could be one of the most powerful memes. And it is in response to Wittstein's presentation, which is fascinating.
Yeah,
in large part.
It's super interesting. So, I mean, I think that part of why we all get so addicted to being in this industry is that the stakes are absolutely goddamn enormous of the things. I mean, honestly, and let's be actually, I'll be a little kumbaya for a minute. Almost all of the things that people are trying to do are an order of magnitude more significant than your average consumer tech startup, right? From like what DeFi wants to be, even if you think it's insane and it's just a house of cards that's going to fall. What DAOs want to be, even if you think they're just vectors for attack. Like, the things that people are trying to do are so much more significant than giving, fucking Instagram influencers another line of revenue or whatever, which is literally all I spent my time on when I was in San Francisco. And so you have this combination of enormous stakes and real serious ability for any kind of loud person in the community to have a meaningful impact on the way that these things nudge, the way that and the battle lines are about narratives. They're not about companies, because it's such an underlying protocol level conversation. So that's why we all get so addicted to it, is that it's this massive live action warfare with really serious outcomes that are the future is unwritten, right? Like, it's like Lawrence of Arabia, like nothing is written.
So I know we share a mutual friend and one of your clients, so I won't name by name, but maybe this is going to be a leading question. It's more of a pre-disclosure if you use this as an answer, but I certainly would consider it. I'll answer it and stop being cryptic after you answer first. Are there any smaller projects that you feel like have really good potential around a meme, or a one-liner, or anything that is extremely effective, but it just might not be as top of mind as what the Bitcoin and like Ethereum memes are, because those are the major assets, those are what everybody pays attention to. Is there anything further down the market value list where a team has either really effectively created the kernel of a meme that just needs to grow in terms of like community attention, or one that's got real potential just because it's so authentic, it's so differentiated, and you can see it taking off? And one of the, this isn't the answer to the cryptic question, but one of the ones that for me made sense, I don't know if there's a meme around it, but at least kind of the one-liner around how do you connect the offline world to the online is Chainlink. And Chainlink maybe got like way ahead of itself in terms of value versus what it can actually do right now. But you kind of knew last year that was going to be pretty effective. Zcash, like HTTPS versus HTTP for money. Like, those seem like they have sticking point, might be some kind of early examples of that. But anyone else come to mind? Because I want to make it more about can you craft a meme? Because I think that's what a lot of people care about in terms of breaking through versus just what are emergent.
Right. So I think that there is two levels. So I would actually argue that there's no one that has anything close to a meme yet. What I am interested in some ways is what are the spaces the spaces where people, once they're explained, people are intuitive that like someone's going to get that right. That feels important for someone to do, because I think that you can build a great meme out of that. And so what I mean by that is that I would rephrase the two examples that you used in a slightly different way. So Zcash, the idea that we need a privacy preserving coin, like feels very intuitive to people. And it feels more and more intuitive the more that you watch surveillance money start to come on the scene in the wake of Libra and the kind of rise of central bank digital currencies. Now, once you get into that, people will have tons of debates about, not like the specific technology behind it, the specific ways, attack vectors based on those things, whether it's going to be regulatory or not. There's a million things in there, but the idea at a core level that there should be privacy preserving money, or that should be a key feature of our money is very resonant to people. Sometimes that resonates right back into people being like, well, what's Bitcoin's plan for that? So that I think is how I put the Zcash, kind of that underlying narrative, it's like the primordial stew of narrative potential. With Chainlink, it's the same thing. There's going to need to be a way to get outside data into smart contracts, right? Like somehow, there's going to have. You can't have these things function entirely outside. That is super resonant. Every technical critique is, fine. Like maybe it won't be Chainlink, or maybe it won't be that way, or maybe it's an impossible problem and it makes us rethink the enterprise of smart contracts. But to the extent that you think that there's anything interesting in that space, that feels like something that someone will solve. And so you get interested in the company, because once a company has, this is something that someone will solve, and then it's just a matter of who, you get, I think there's a lot of power there. I think another one right now that fits in that paradigm is Cosmos in some ways. I think that the more that when people see a bajillion friggin' chains launching all the time, and they have any sense of free market, there's going to be competition and whatever, the idea of interoperability and something that can plug in, it feels intuitive. It may actually even be more intuitive given that there are a couple high-profile projects, right? That there's this kind of battle about how you would do it between Cosmos and Polkadot or whatever. So I think interoperability feels like one. I don't know that I think, I'm probably just forgetting some off the top of my head right now, but I think that I will say for sure I don't think anyone has a quick one-liner or anything that's memified yet. But I look, whenever I'm talking with a company or a client, that's what I'm thinking about is what is the thing. I think Coda is exploring some interesting space with this. So Coda has a succinct blockchain that's their language. So they use ZK snarks to keep a constant size. So they replace the entire history of the blockchain that you can audit with a mathematical proof that the thing that you agreed to before is the same plus the new stuff that's been added. I think that has a lot of hurdles because it's so, it was very, speaking of things that were intuitive, it's really intuitive to people that you can go back and look at the entire history of a blockchain. And that's kind of the source of truth. Having to then abstract that can be really a challenge. So I do think that they have that area. But on the flip side, a constant size blockchain means that they preserve forever, if it works, the power for anyone to be a full node, any device to be a full node. I can imagine that being resonant to the extent, it's almost though in contrast to, there's been so much conversation about how hard it is to sync an Ethereum full node and all this sort of stuff. So I feel like there's probably a million more that I'm not remembering, but that's what I'm looking at is that underlying what makes sense to people intuitively from someone's going to do this or this should be done.
It's interesting that you seem to implicitly make a distinction between you call it the primordial stew of a meme, right? So basically a very cohesive narrative that seems like it's supposed to fully baked, it just hasn't taken off yet. At what point does an interesting narrative become a meme? Are they interrelated, or is it just like memes are memes, right? They take off and no one really knows how and when. It's really are they black swans, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's
maybe one way to think about it.
It's really hard. I think it's also it's particularly hard for a company to manufacture a meme about itself. I think part of what has made memes resonant, and even my Ethereum is money is working. It's that's not coming. Vitalik didn't say that. It's Ryan, Sean Adams, and all these guys who are pushing it, and they're associated closely with Ethereum, and they're kind of like the front line of the Ethereum guard, but they're not. They have their own company, their own funds, their own whatever. Same obviously Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto didn't call up Michael and ask him to write this presentation, as their new marketing outfit. It was kind of authentically, it feels authentically generated and kind of rising up from the community. So I find it incredibly hard. It's almost like as a company, if you're trying to to memify it, you really have to like put out what you're doing into the world, and to some extent let those things come. Like I don't think that, for example, Cosmos is really memeing interoperability. They're just talking about it all the time, and they're doing it. You know?
It's more about like self-awareness and then like an embrace of what your customers, what your users, like what people say, like, right? It's like the difference between what you say about yourself versus
exactly
what people say about you as your brand.
Putting on my like consultative, like strategic consultative hat, I think the thing that that you can advise people to do is embrace the simple kind of spear tip thing about them that is the resonant thing, knowing, and basically it's really hard for entrepreneurs and just all of the people at an early project to to be comfortable with the inherent reductiveness of a single thing. I'm sure like if Zach is listening to this, right, as we talk about Cosmos, it's so much more than interoperability. Like I guarantee the code is listening to this. They're like, no, but there's so much more.
It's not that complicated.
But I think that you can understand that like people need like easy doors in, and it feels like as an entrepreneur, as a project, it's better if you give them 100 doors, but really just having like one really super crystal clear door that you kind of know what's behind, or at least you think you know what's behind, is often a lot easier. So I think it's so enormous. Like when let's put it this way, if I'm ever taking on kind of a project to consult from a strategic or communications perspective, and no part of our agreement or scope of work does it say we're going to create the meme, right? It's going to be, we're going to explore like the narratives that are really authentic to you and help you figure out that core positioning in the context of the market, and then we're going to figure out the right content to tell that story. And it's going to be some combination of writing, it's going to be whatever. But one thing, it's not, I'm not going to distill it down, or promise at least to distill it down to a one-liner that you can smash, on Twitter.
Yeah.
Just because I get fired after 3 months every single time, if I promise that.
So what is there a consistent piece of feedback or kind of set of list of pieces of feedback that you give most of your clients just as a starting point to engage, right? Like here's the framework for how you should be thinking about this. Is there like a do this, don't do this kind of master list in kind of broad strokes that you advise people to stick to?
There's more of a process than a master list. So the process is, I think the thing that I tend to find that people haven't done the exercise of is, how does whatever story we want to tell fit with the larger stories that are going on? So they because you cannot not be myopic to some extent if you're building a company. Jesus, I unless you're maybe with the possible exception of you're building a media company where it's your job to pay attention to everything. But everyone, it's so hard, there's so many things to do, right? So taking the time and having the exercise to be like, well, what's shifted in terms of how we talk about all these different things? What's like, when we say X, how is it going to be received based on the conversations that people are having? In fact, more broadly, what's the space? If we're an exchange, what do people think that there's room in the exchange market? Do they think it's so crowded? How are people talking about that? What are the things that they think are missing from the exchange market? What are things that are that they're not thinking about exchanges yet, but that we could make them think? So that market context is one. The second is actually part of the process. The second part of the process is really about mediums, because mediums, the right medium for the message shifts so dramatically on the basis of what type of market it is, on the basis of things that you can't control, like Twitter algorithms. So when I started Long Read Sunday, people weren't threading as much yet. That wasn't yet a huge medium. There were some people. It had started. Certainly when I started, no one was doing threads for curation, right? Threads, a thread of threads type thing. It was definitely the first one of those that I saw. And Twitter liked it. It was a new thing. People it was promoted, and the algos popped it. Now threads get fucking destroyed. I have thought seriously about just pulling Long Read Sunday from Twitter, because it gets buried. People who are literal super fans who have been subscribed for a year and read everything are I literally never see an interview.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And so to me, that's.
It's also crazy that you're always at the mercy of the algorithm.
Exactly. Yeah. And I would say that there's as a content creator, it is not worth a single ounce of my time and tears to weep at that, because it's just the case. You just have to know. You have to be prepared. You have to deal with it. Another example is, Twitter did this amazing thing in some ways in buying Periscope, which is this great product. I mean, people who are, like, probably the majority of people who are watching this are watching it there versus any other medium where it's streaming at the moment. But they don't care about it. Like, they've clearly given it no love. And what's so amazing about it is that you don't have to be a user of that app to actually discover it. It's just built in, right? So, you know, it's really like you get however many viewers you have, like, it's basically it's proportional to your followers. So if you've built a good Twitter following, they're going to see it even if you haven't, if you don't have them following you on Periscope or whatever. The problem is that it's buried up, like people only happen to catch it if they're on mobile because it sits up there at the top. People, when they watch, their instinct isn't to like. Because they just start watching, right? And Twitter doesn't see that as like engagement, right? It's not counting that as an engagement metric, really, and so it's not promoting it. So it's kind of like there are limits to that, and you just have to know these things. But I think about this all the time in terms of what different opportunities for people to tell their story are, right? Like, you know, should companies start a newsletter right now? Should they start a podcast? Should they do whatever? And so I think I spend, like, I start always with like message and what the message is, but I spend a lot of time, especially these days, on what's the right medium for this. I mean, even like if you look last summer, like the depth of the bear market is an awesome time to write big long posts because people actually read it and engage with it. People are not doing that the same way anymore. You know, so it's really interesting, and I think it's highly dynamic in this space for sure.
We covered a lot. Any parting words of wisdom? So maybe not just how you think about like the hit list for how you explain marketing and general engagement and PR strategies, but just in general for newcomers to the industry that are down the rabbit hole, excited, want to get involved, but they're like, I didn't even know where to start, or I don't know how to make a name for myself, or I don't know how to get found.
Well, I think that trying to, like, spending some time figuring out which part of this thing really like gets you fired up is super valuable. And it doesn't have to be a single answer. Like, I find myself often feeling like rather tribeless comparatively. You know, like I think I tend to, going back to that perspective, like I said, I thought I was going to work in like post-conflict stuff or current conflict stuff forever. So I find myself more personally driven or pulled back to the Bitcoin unseizable money side when I've heard stories of people who like spent time and people who have like lost their houses and had all their stuff confiscated. But that's me personally, and so that gives me kind of like a kind of an anchor point from which to engage with the industry. I think that people knowing, on a really deep level, not just because it's like the community that they happen to resonate with the most. I would also say that like you don't have to like everyone in a space to be a proud and vocal member of the community. You know, I've been watching, I don't know what his real name is, Distributed Heath is his handle on Twitter, and he's very like proudly gay, he's out, and he's been hammering the Bitcoiner community for homophobia and for misogyny that he sees kind of run rampant, and he's making it a point. And I think that's really awesome that he's not backing down from this community. He's not going to just go find himself in something else because he believes in sound money. He's really passionate about that. But he's also not going to let something that he's going to try to use his voice to make it closer to the space that he wants, right?
Yep.
And I look at that and I'm like, fuck yeah, like do that. And so I think that it's important too, is like, the lines seem to be clearly drawn, but they're really like, the beauty of these things is that they are permissionless, right? And you can get in there and you can do what you want. Now, it's what agony you want to take on, you know? You also don't have to go fight. You can just find the set of people who are kind of, seem to be most aligned with you. But I think that part of what makes this whole space so interesting is that like you just can't easily draw lines. You can't import presumptions of political bias or belief system from anywhere else onto this. It's just such a weird melange. I mean, all of us feel like this. All it takes is one person who you've been listening to and you totally agree with in one thing, then start to tweet about something where you're like, that's literally the most abhorrent like worldview in the world to me. Like, what does it mean about me that I'm super aligned with you over here? But that's like how the world used to be before we were drawn into these easy buckets of like pollster demographics. Like, it used to be like, you fucking scream at each other over wine at dinner and you agree to disagree at the end because there's 6 other things that you like about each other and your kids hang out, and that's just the way the world works. But anyway, so I don't know. I think that like spending time finding your space, finding what you're passionate about, as cheesy an answer as that is, I think is really valuable. And then make content. Like there is no, as much as it seems like there are too many podcasts, like bullshit. Like that one, there's a ton of great podcasts. There's also a ton of podcasts that aren't great or don't offer something new or are totally fine, but just like haven't stood out. But like, at what point did we decide that the only version of a podcast that's available is a one-on-one interview, right? Like, there's so many different ways you can do it. Do a roundtable, do a whatever, this is what I keep talking about. Drop a bomb of a series with like the 6 people who all have a really interesting point of view on something. Drop them all at once, make a huge splash, and then say, I'll come back again. I'm on Netflix now.
I feel personally attacked. No, it's interesting that you bring that up because we've talked about this internally too, right? Is this a great use of time, right? I have 90,000 Twitter followers, right? So I know that we're going to get some distribution from this. We're working with the Blockers Group guys. I've been around for a while, so I'm fortunate to be able to pick up the phone or shoot an email, and people are like, yeah, I'll come on and we'll have a chat. But like, is it different, right? Like, I know that we could put something good out there, right? And I like talking to people, so I know that it could be something good. But is it different, right? Like, what's the unique angle? Is it just like people want to see me interviewing? There's a case for that.
There is a case.
But I think your larger point of it doesn't matter. Just like push it out there because there's so many different niches that you can fill. In a market that's just exploding in terms of overall growth.
Let's also put it this way. I'm a lot more interested in you figuring that out while doing something that for now, like, is fun for you, is engaging, is interesting, it's worth the time that it takes. Like, figure it out that rather than just not doing it and coming back to it. Because this is the other thing, and this is something that I will say too to any kind of creators, even if you're just doing the traditional one-on-one. Like, it is such a gift to this industry that so many people are willing to spend so much time trying to create content. I mean, this is a learner's paradise like nothing I've ever seen. Like it is so cool, and I don't think that like it may be that your like first 50 podcasts you ultimately view as a false start because that wasn't the right format, and you should be streaming a game while you talk about crypto. Like who knows what will change? But I think that doing it in public and learning in public, like. The only potential cost is your time and whether you could be spending it better doing other things. Because if 10 people hear your podcast, it's still 10 people who decided to use their time who are like, that's good, it's worth it.
And the other thing that's super interesting about that is people talk about compound growth quite a bit, but until you've produced content, you don't realize that compound growth can mean really, really tiny growth. Lots of like peaks and valleys in like a very tiny growth environment, and then all of a sudden just something fucking hits, right? And it goes both ways, right? Like in terms of like I don't know how many podcasts I've done where I'm on the other side, right? I'm getting interviewed or in the press or whatever you're just talking about, an update or whatnot, and you never know what's going to get picked up. I remember I did the Epicenter podcast last year, and Fred Wilson blogged about it, and then a few other people picked it up, and you just don't know, and some of it depends on the interviewer, right? I've done that same exact interview, I don't know how many times, but they just did, Brian Crane, just did a phenomenal job with the interview. He knew his shit like cold. He knew the inner workings of how we were thinking about the business, and it was great, but still loose interview. It wasn't pre-recorded, right? So I think some of it depends on the person, and so much of it just depends on the frequency and like the muscle memory, right? Because he's done 150 of those. And so there's kind of compound growth in that respect as well.
Totally, and I do agree that it's like for those of you who are creating content, there is some randomness too, and just like right place, right timing, which is probably the best argument for consistently doing it. It's like I know there's sometimes like days where I'm like, this is like the best 3 at 3 I've done. It's absolute fire. Same with LRS. It's like this one is absolute friggin' gold, and it just doesn't pop, doesn't hit. It just is.
It can be very frustrating. It's like I've done that with posts before, where I spend like a week going back and forth on certain things, and it's well researched, and then and it's just a complete dud, and then I'll shit something out in 15 minutes, and it's just like fire, right? And then the flip side, some of those fire posts are like very topical, and you can maybe get like one news cycle. Some of the ones that didn't get picked up immediately, you'll see it like retweeted like 6 months later. It's like dude, this guy knew something, and then it blows up, right?
I wrote this post.
You just don't know.
I wrote this post last year called Complexity Theater.
Mhm.
That like no one really noticed right away. It was like fine, like did like a very middling amount of claps on Medium.
Yeah.
Like to use that silly metric or heuristic. But then like it continuously, like every month or two, someone like uses that term, re-references it.
Yeah.
It's like probably the most resonant like term that I've introduced through a written piece. Like unfortunately, I love writing, but I don't do as much of it because it's easier right now with the amount of kind of consulting work and all these other things to produce like a visual medium or different. I also think it's more like right now, to the best of my knowledge, I'm the only daily podcast in the entire space from a news and analysis standpoint. There's some YouTubers and guys who do that stuff, but a little bit more like streaming and charts and that sort of thing. But from just a straight like here's the news and here's my analysis, I'm like the only one. And I wanted to fill that gap because I think there's a commute gap. Like, and I'm pretty sure that when this market picks up, I mean, really, that's all I'm doing is was waiting for that, like in some ways, and just kind of building that out. But yeah, from a writing standpoint, like that complexity theory thing, it keeps being resonant. And like the Bitcoin account, when it got restored, whoever the hell is taking this on now, when it stopped being a Bitcoin Cash account, like one of the first things they tweeted was that post again. So you never.
Well, if you're looking for 3 at 3, if you're looking for Long Read Sunday, or exclusively if you're looking for the Narrative Watch on Mondays, we do work with the notorious @NLW on all the above and syndicate his content and do a little original stuff for Messari as well. Nathaniel, thanks for coming in. And
Thanks
always fun to see you and chat about this. I'm sure this should be a good episode. And if people want to find you or me, I think most people know by now. So,
Always Twitter.
Exactly. All right. It's been a big week here at Messari. Hope everybody has enjoyed this slate of interviews that we've done. We got a bunch more good ones next week. I'll be in Crypto Springs in LA early half of the week. So we'll certainly have some good conversations out there. You can expect to have these on iTunes and Spotify from the Blockworks Group team in the next couple of weeks. So thanks again. Until next time, enjoy your weekend. Peace.